Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 6. This week, we're going to be talking about chapter 6, which covers data management. This is a critical area in health information management. So why is this chapter so important? Healthcare organizations have always generated a lot of data, and now with electronic health record systems, we generate even more. This data is used for research, reimbursement, utilization management, medical legal defenses, and many, many other uses. Here are some key points that you need to know to be successful, to understand this material, understand the role of data management, not just for the quiz, but beyond. First of all, we need to think about data sources and types. Data comes from many places. The obvious one is the EHR, but when you think about it, we have outside labs, we have imaging, we have data from other sources. We share data with the state shares data with the federal government, and so on. We need to know the difference between the clinical data that is about the patients and the care they receive, and the administrative data, which is more about logistics, operations, reimbursement, and so on. We'll cover another important point, which is data structure and quality. We'll talk about data elements, data sets, databases, and indices, and why they matter. One of the challenges with over 5,000 EHR systems in the United States is that they all have different field lengths, which makes interoperability and the ability to share data more challenging. So we'll be kind of bringing back some of that, the concept of interoperability, and touching on it in this area. We'll also talk about data dictionaries, which help us manage the data, and we'll get into that. Thirdly, we have governance and stewardship. A lot of people use these terms interchangeably. They're different things. They're basic with the same purpose. They're setting rules about how the data is used and how it is protected. We'll talk about data quality and data integrity. These are critical points. When we talk about high quality data, we're talking about data that is accurate, complete, consistent, timely, and accessible. This also touches on the area of clinical documentation integrity. In other words, we're getting the documentation out there so we understand what is going on, and we're not just dealing with vague terms like pneumonia, heart failure. We're talking about left-sided heart failure. We're talking about viral pneumonia, and so on. And then we'll get into policies, bylaws, and auditing. Especially now with AI, the role of auditing is more critical than ever. And hospital bylaws, contracts, policies set the framework for how these things are managed. And then lastly, we'll talk about technology and standards. This is a role of DICOM, HL7, FHIR, and others, how we can exchange data back and forth. So there's a lot of information in this chapter. What's the best way to approach it? I would strongly advise start on the first page of your book with the learning objectives in the key terms. Use the glossary that's in your book to get clarification on anything that you're unclear on. Use the check your understanding questions to test your knowledge and make sure that you're getting the material. And then if you work in healthcare settings, especially, think about how this stuff applies and get the big picture. I think you can hear my birds in the background. They're saying hello. I have 2 parrots that are sitting up here with me. They're normally a little camera shy, but I'll be working on that and seeing if I can introduce them to you later in the term. Anyway, that's all I have for you. We'll see you online. Bye now.